Welcome back to the Secret Stash podcast. My name is Chuck Charlton, and today's topic, it's been a while since we did one of these. Today's topic is about, I don't really need to sign anything, do I? And that's specific around a buyer's request that I got on the phone. We were talking about their plans and what they were looking for, set a time to meet at the office, and they said to me, well, Chuck, we don't need to sign anything. And I thought, well, actually the way I answered, I said, well, you don't have to, but technically you may want to because it's actually pretty good for you. And I may even argue it's better for you than me, but we can talk about it at the office. And that's what we did. We had a really good conversation. So this podcast is really just a summary of what we talked about and what I talk about as it relates to buyer representation. So the way this buyer compensation and representation has been skewed by the media, even by other agents. I think agents are almost the worst enemy in this because they've turned it into a tool where it's like a commitment. It's a lockdown for a buyer, and that's why buyers say things like, well, I don't have to sign anything, because they don't want to be committed. They're not sure even if you're going to do a good job as an agent. So anyway, I think the thing about buyer representation, there's a reason why it's there. Before about the mid-1990s, it didn't exist. So there was nothing there to protect a buyer. So if I was going shopping with you and we saw 4 or 5 different properties in 1987, let's say, and you wanted to buy one, what happened with every single one of those properties is, even though I was working with you as a buyer, I was working for the seller. They paid me, so that's how things worked. And to this day, that still remains. Sellers typically would foot the bill for the buyer agent. Now, that's an oversimplification, but what it means is the buyers don't have to pay us directly, okay? You could argue the buyer pays the asking price, so on some level, the fees are worked into the price. But think about it like this. The buyer has to save up for a down payment, plus the land transfer tax, plus the lawyer, plus furniture, and if you add a buyer agent fee onto that, it may take them that much longer to purchase the home. So historically speaking, it made sense for the seller to pay the fees for the buyer's agent because usually there's a pretty decent chunk of equity there. So that hasn't changed. That's still remained to this day. But what they realized was, if I showed you properties, but I didn't actually work for you, which means I didn't have to point out things, I didn't have to negotiate on your behalf, enough buyers were upset by that process and didn't do so well that they changed the model. And that's what buyer representation is. And so it's a document in writing saying that from a buyer's perspective, even though you as my agent are going to get paid from somebody else, you're going to look after my interest. And that's what it really means, is there's 2 things. A buyer's giving us permission to get paid from someone else, and usually they're okay with that. And the second thing is they want us to actually protect their interests in a fiduciary relationship, the same as a doctor, lawyer, psychologist. That's what that means. It means that we are on the buyer's side. So when I explained this to the buyers, I said, you know that this means that I'm actually committing to you as much as you're committing to me, that I have to do what's best for you. And they said, wow, I never thought of it that way. And that's the thing, is if we put the spotlight on the buyer and their needs instead of what our industry does, and the traditional salespeople in real estate, what they do is they see it as a commitment tactic to kind of lock down a buyer, because that's really the only drawback. Is if you look at a buyer representation agreement, the only downside to that agreement is the commitment, is that, hey, if I buy a house, then you're going to get paid. So where does that put us? Where it puts us is agents need to do a better job at explaining this stuff, okay? So I'm going to list a series of things in this video, and we're going to talk about each one of them as they relate to how it's good for a buyer. So question one is, would you like your agent to keep your information confidential? How does that play out in real life? So if you made an offer on a property, but you could afford more, your pre-approval was for more, your agent doesn't have to share that. Now, in the old way, in 1987, like I talked about, they would actually go to the seller and say, well, here's the buyer's offer, but guess what? I think they'd pay more. That doesn't happen with buyer agency. Would you like full access to your options on the market? So when you have a buyer representation relationship, that agent is obliged to share any information that they know, including properties off the market, any opportunities that show up. Whereas if you work with a listing agent, they're just obliged to show you first and foremost their company's properties, and then maybe showing you other stuff if they think there's a chance you're going to buy it. Now here's a big one. Would you like your agent to point out reasons not to buy? Now this is a gray territory because in a buyer agency relationship, they should. Now, does every agent point out everything? I don't know. I think I try and look at it as if I was the buyer and reverse the roles and say, what would I want to know? But I think a sign of a good agent, and definitely a sign of buyer representation, is that your agent's saying, hey, you should be concerned about this, or watch out for this. I've seen this before. It's a big problem. So under buyer agency, if your agent knows it, they should be explaining it to you. Now this is a big one too. Would you like to be given first right of refusal on a property? Now what does that mean? So let's say you were looking for an investment property. And we deal with this with investors all the time because they do not want to be committed at all. However, if we introduce that buyer to a property, a good investment opportunity that we would want to buy, we actually need permission by the buyer, if we're in buyer representation, to actually purchase the home. So they get first crack at it even before us. Their needs come before us. Next one, would you like your agent to negotiate on your behalf? That's a big one too, because let's be honest, if you're dealing with a listing agent, they're not going to negotiate on your behalf, they're going to negotiate on the seller's behalf. So having an agent negotiate and push. Here's another example. If the agent found out that there was a job relocation, or if they found out the seller would take less for a property, they have to share that with you. Any advantage you can get as a buyer, your agent should be giving you. Now, right before an offer, what a lot of agents should do, I don't know if they all do it, we do it, what they should do is provide you relevant sales information in the area. And so if an agent's doing a good job as a buyer representative, they should be providing information about factual market data. If you deal with a listing agent, what you're going to find is they're going to give you the information, that part of the data that justifies the seller's higher asking price. So you need to ask yourself as a buyer, do I want the truth told to me, or do I want a version of the truth that justifies the seller's asking price? Now, sellers are not, and their agents are not obligated to give us details about why they're selling, but once in a while it comes out. So as a buyer, would you like to know why the sellers are selling? If you do, you'll get it through buyer representation. You'll probably not get it through the listing agent. So those are just a few examples of how you as a buyer can actually be protected under buyer representation. Now there's a lot more to talk about around this topic. And if you have any questions about buyer representation, you can always reach us here at the office. And this is Chuck Charlton from the Charlton Advantage team with another episode of The Secret Stash.